Thank you so much. Okay, so I started with a quote from former US Secretary of State. Here's another quote. This is not from Henry Kissinger. We, meaning the United States, we were postured for catastrophic failure in northeastern Syria because we entered into an alliance with the PKK. The YPG, the Kurdish force we worked with on the ground, is the PKK. This is a terrorist organization that seeks to partition Turkey between Kurds and Turks. By allying with the PKK, we set ourselves on a collision course with Turkey. That was unwise. The strategic prize in this situation is the international orientation of Turkey. Anybody know who said that? Anybody know who said that? Can we get all the microphones to be working, Michael?
It has a beautiful ring to it, but I can't quite place it.
It was Michael Doran. He said that just a few days ago. Michael, can you expand on that, please?
When the Obama administration felt compelled to fight ISIS, for the longest time, Obama tried to avoid intervention in Syria. But when he finally went in with the absolute lightest military footprint possible. Because he didn't want to get sucked into the civil war, and he didn't want to have to fight against Assad, and he didn't want to get on the wrong side of Tehran and Moscow because he was trying to negotiate the nuclear deal. And the YPG looked beautiful in that regard because the YPG had good relations with Moscow and good relations with or at least was not fighting the regime. And so he could reassure the Russians and the Iranians and Damascus that he was not going to go after them, and yet also find a partner to destroy ISIS. And so they convinced themselves when they did this that it would be temporary, tactical, transactional, those were the words, and that they could somehow work things out with Turkey. And I don't think they were aware of the fact that they were aligning with the PKK, but they never really looked at that contradiction square in the face and came up with an acceptable way to get around it. And,
okay.
And as time went on, it just got worse.
Sorry, Michael, did you just say they were aware they were aligning
aware
with the PKK?
Yes, of course they were aware. Of course they were
I just wanted to make sure I heard you correctly. Okay, don't forget you have to press the button to be heard. Çağrı, what do you know about any potential negotiations that happened at that stage between the Obama administration and the Turkish government before that alliance in Syria happened?
In fact, we remember in 2012, Turkey and Obama administration had a lot of diplomatic negotiations about the future of Syria. Particularly that time, Obama administration was keen to support the Syrian opposition through Turkey. We remember there were some programs called Train and Donate. The Syrian opposition would be trained by Turkish-American military against regime that time. And of course, Obama drew a very strict red line about the usage of chemical weapons. Chemical weapons, if ever to be used by regime, Assad regime, would be a precondition for an attack for the
Absolutely.
regime.
Correct.
But then they used
chemical weapons, and Obama did nothing.
Nothing happened. So Turkey started to yes, thank you. Turkey started to lose its trust on Obama administration in this case, and Obama, as Mike said now, Obama has found a new ally. But that time, Turkey didn't know that Obama had some secret negotiations with YPG. But in fact, if you go back to 20 years ago, during the creation of the no-fly zone in north of Iraq after the first Gulf War, there was an Operation Provide Comfort, which was called Poised Hammer operation that time. Even that period, some American government officials had direct contacts with PKK terrorist organization. And there were clear photos of those government agents who participated to meetings of high-level PKK terrorist leaders. And there were some suspicions whether those Americans are transferring some arms to terrorist organization in northern Iraq in Kandil Mountain in 1990s. Then when we came to the Obama YPD deal in 2013, then we can analyze that there were some roots of this long relations between PYD or PKK and some governmental
okay,
members
but you see,
of US.
I think possibly, out of everything you've explained there, maybe in terms of what we're discussing, the most significant thing that you've revealed is that Turkey didn't know that Obama was speaking to the YPG.
No.
Anybody else on this? Matthew?
Yeah, I'd love to jump in. It's true, what Çağrı was saying, that the United States had officials who were meeting with the PKK in the 90s, because at that point, the PKK was not yet designated a terrorist organization by the U.S. government. And it was only in the Bush administration that finally happened. And I have to say, it was a battle. I was involved with it at the time working at the White House. It was a battle. There were a lot of people, especially in the Central Command, so that's the part of the U.S. military that's responsible for the Middle East. A lot of people there who found it inconvenient truth to recognize the PKK as a terrorist group. But that said, just before the Gulf War, that second Gulf War, President Bush signed a declaration with then Prime Minister Tony Blair and then Prime Minister Barroso of Portugal, in which one of the goals of the war, one of the reasons to fight the war, not talking about weapons of mass destruction, it was to eliminate the PKK's haven in northern Iraq. And President Bush promised to do so, face to face with President Erdogan. And for years, for several years, basically the U.S. Central Command simply refused to implement the order because it is just such a more complicated and difficult world if the U.S. treats the PKK for what it is, a terrorist organization. And I think that's replaying itself right now.
Kılıç, sorry, I forgot I have a microphone that I need to keep to my mouth. It's the good terrorist, bad terrorist, that whole issue again and again and again and again. Does anybody in Turkey understand how the Americans were approaching the fight against Daesh? I mean, and if they understand it, how are they able to reconcile Turkey's own security situation with the American aim of destroying Daesh? And of course, Turkey has contributed to that fight, as we know as well. But if we're talking about U.S.-Turkey relations, we're looking at Washington and Ankara.
Well, we have to state that from the very beginning, actually, from the 1990s on, Matt just mentioned that Turkey stated its uncomfortability with the U.S. relation with the PKK or its tolerance to PKK in northern Iraq. And after the second Gulf War, actually, when Turkey stated its concern one more time and stated actually the coordinates and the reorganization of the group in northern Iraq, we see that United States preferred to attack other groups in the region, in a very adjacent regions to PKK camps actually, and stated that our priority is right now to fight against Iraqi insurgency, and after that we will, consider your demands. And when the Syria crisis happened and when Daesh became the most significant terror threat for the United States, we started to see again the same pattern actually. What we saw is Turkey was explaining its concern about YPG and potential ramification of what can happen if a terrorist group would be armed and trained by the United States, leaving aside the legitimacy of the organization, the capacity building of the organization, what could happen in terms of what can they do about this know-how. United States one more time said, well, our priority is ISIS here, and in the future, don't get concerned about that. We have commitments to our NATO ally, and we make sure that this relation will be temporary. But what happened after the fall of Raqqa actually is we started to see that there are new scenarios for ISIS in the region. For example, General Votel in his hearing mentioned that, well, we can use it against Iran. And then it started to be considered as a stabilization force. What we started to see as Turks in this country is there is a capacity building of a terror group which may lead to the establishment of an autonomous zone or a small state or statelet in the region, which for the foreseeable future can endanger Turkey's national security. And it is not, the message was not given. And however, each and every time, United States was mentioning that they have other priorities. And it was very much against the spirit of alliance. And the mutual distrust between two countries started to rise actually after this point.
I don't think American officials understood how much they were infuriating the Turks. Or they thought it was a kind of irrational thing, because they had this idea, which is not absurd if you look at it from an American point of view. They had this idea that Turkey should feel comfortable with the U.S. relationship in Syria, because the U.S. is acting as a restraint, because Turkey trusts us and knows that we are concerned about Turkish security. We are acting as a restraint on any impulses that the YPG might have to carry out operations against Turkey. So we are the buffer. And isn't it better for you that we're there to do these things than if we leave and the Russians come in or the YPG is just on its own? And so they convinced themselves that this is going to actually mollify the Turks, when really it enraged them even more, because the Turks couldn't say this to the Americans, but you Americans are now you're giving them international legitimacy. You're giving them a special international legitimacy because you're our best ally. And you are becoming a mediator between us and the YPG. And all of a sudden, General Mazloum is on the same level in your mind as an equal, a counterpart to the president of Turkey, your greatest ally in this region. And that's a horrible affront and a threat to Turkey at the same time.
Okay, so obviously we've started by looking at this extremely current situation in terms of the references of the whole topic of this panel, and we will look at other issues as well, areas of divergence between Washington and Ankara. Okay, so let's address this issue. Your theory, Michael, about how the Americans were approaching the work with the YPG and possibly being able to persuade Turkey, or at least having the idea that their cooperation with the YPG could also provide some sort of security to Turkey. Now, clearly, that theory was blown completely out of the water on the 9th of October when Operation Peace Spring began. So the question I'd like you guys to think about is whether we have now reached the low point of U.S.-Turkey relations of recent history, because of Turkey saying to the United States repeatedly over a certain period, if you don't do what we need, we're going to take the action ourselves. If you don't do it, we're going to do something about it ourselves. And then on October the 9th, those American troops leaving the areas around northeastern Syria, where they had been working with the YPG, and Turkey moving in to northeastern Syria, surely, how can it go any lower? Because there was absolutely no understanding between the two sides, and Recep Tayyip Erdogan said, this is it. We do it now. Whatever you think, Washington. Çağrı?
We had better times.
Yeah.
So when we look back to 50, maybe 60 years of Turkish-American relations, we had some troubles in the past. But when we look and analyze the nature of the troubles, there are some similarities between them and the situation today. Take, for instance, the Turkish operation in Cyprus in 1974. Just a few months after Turkish operations, the famous arms embargo came from Washington. That time also, Turkey tried to save the lives of hundreds, thousands of Turkish Cypriots from EOKA, a Greek junta-supported criminal organization, and Americans tried to stop. And Turkey said, okay, let's do it with British. But Americans did not intervene and persuade British to make a joint operation. Then Turks once more said, okay, if you do not intervene directly or through United Nations to the situation in the island, then we will make the operation. And America didn't do anything. Then Turks did. So then the arms embargo came. This time, the same thing happened. I mean, Turkey several times, but maybe we can take it back to December last year. For 10 months, Turkey tried to persuade Trump government to first clear the safe zone area out of terrorists. Second, take back all the arms which were provided by American army to the terrorists. And third, patrol to the safe zone together, and then make it a suitable area for resettlement of the Syrian immigrants or refugees. However, although President Trump tweeted and said that they would withdraw from Syria, they didn't do anything. And they did not do anything to disarm the terrorists as well, but they proposed to restart negotiations between Turkish counterparts. And then we started negotiations and another negotiations, round of negotiations, endless negotiations, but that time President Erdogan repeatedly said, finally at United Nations General Assembly speech, he said, okay, if you will not help us or support us to do it together, then we will do it alone. And he did it. I wish United States would have acted more firmly in this issue and cooperate with Turkey previously, not after Turkey decided to intervene to the situation. But the main objectives of the peace spring is cut clear, and it is not differing from what President Erdogan had said 10 months ago. First, we need to clear all this zone, whether you call it a safe haven or safe zone or something else. It's 20 miles deep, and this 20 miles came from President Trump. It was not a proposal of President Erdogan. Trump, during a phone call, said, okay, 20 miles deep zone, and extending from Turkish-Syrian border on the west to the Syrian-Iraqi border on the east, which is some 430 kilometers area. And this area would be cleared of all kinds of criminal terrorist organizations. And then when this area is secured, then it would be a temporary resettlement position for the Syrian refugees. And as President Erdogan mentioned in United Nations, it would take between 1 million, 1.5 million people. Both the current settlement areas in the region and proposed building activities.
Sure. Now, the point is the United States has recognized that, the need for that safe zone. NATO has recognized the threat that Turkey faces at its border with Syria. Russia recognizes it. But the point here is the unilateral action that was ordered by Ankara. How much has that irked the United States, and how do relations recover from that point? Because clearly we saw the reaction from the US Congress, the sanctions, all of it, all of the talk going on, which was bipartisan, and the anger being felt in Congress. How does Turkey recover the situation from where we are now and the reaction that's being produced in Washington?
I'd just like to paint the picture that most Americans see from that. I think it's very important because there's a very simple story that's being told that tugs at American emotions. Americans feel that in the Middle East over the last 17 years, things have not gone very well. And the only success stories that they have, or the two biggest success stories that they had, were the defeat of ISIS and saving of the Kurds from ISIS. And we found these people, the Kurds, it isn't in the American mind, the Americans didn't ally with the YPG. Right or wrong, that's the way it's popularly understood, and a lot of people in government see it this way too. And I can say more about that later. But the story is, there were these people that were threatened by ISIS, but who were ready to fight for their homes. The United States allied with them, destroyed ISIS, and then was starting to stabilize Syria on the basis of that relationship. And then President Erdogan ordered an intervention that drove the Americans, your ally, Turkey's ally, from Syria, and attacked the people who fought with us at great loss of life to themselves against ISIS, this horrible enemy. That's the picture that they see, and that is one of the main reasons for all of the anger. And telling a story, if you think about it, if you're a Turkish diplomat and you have to talk to the American people, or you're somebody like me and you have to talk to the American people and tell a different story, you have to start saying things like, well, you have to understand, it's more complex, there's YPG, PYD, PKK, and you have to start building this complex story, whereas the story that they have in their head is very simple. Good guys aligned with the United States killed bad guys, and Erdogan came in and smashed it.
Absolutely critical point, this. And we're going to talk about this very, very specific subject in just a moment. And I've got what I think are really, really interesting examples of how the dynamic is changing and how the Americans are slightly changing their message about the homogeneity of the Kurds that you're talking about, Michael. But Matthew?
Yeah, that's actually a point I wanted to start addressing with this intervention, but I'll hold off for you. But I think that the answer to your question as to how relations re-improve, or is this the bottom? Well, first of all, is no, it's not the bottom. It is likely to get worse if the pause doesn't become a ceasefire, because Congress is then likely to pass legislation that's veto-proof that will compel or that will impose sanctions in a way President Trump can't block. So that's how things would get worse. But I actually think they're going to get better. Because I don't see any interest that Turkey has in going beyond the goals that have been articulated, right? Turkey has long sought this safe zone. The depth it wanted was around 30 kilometers. I mean, for a couple of years, these discussions have been going on. They were on the verge of a breakthrough comprehensive agreement on the Friday, which was the Friday before the Sunday when the fateful phone call happened on October 6th. It was going to be a comprehensive agreement that demarcated the safe zone, that called for joint patrolling, as Çağrı Bey was saying, may have even had something to do with the return to the F-35 program. That's all very difficult to believe could happen right now. But if Turkey simply establishes this 30-kilometer safe zone and confounds the critics who for some reason believe Turkey is making a territorial grab and is going to conduct ethnic cleansing against the Kurds. I was asked that question by an Istanbul-based North American journalist on Friday. Like, where do you get the idea that Turkey wants to conduct ethnic cleansing?
Matthew, was he asking the question on behalf of the people watching back in the United States? Because if he's a North American correspondent based in Istanbul, he can't ask that question on his own behalf. He knows the answer.
Yes, I think that's right. The narrative, as Michael was saying, is so skewed right now and based so much on a lack of understanding, lack of information, downright ignorance, that, yeah, that is the message that you have to bring back if you're based in Turkey, or else you're considered to be pro-Erdogan, pro-Turkish, and subjective. Yeah.
Just to follow up something that Mr. Bryza mentioned about things will get better. This is one of the talking points for a long time among the optimists in Washington, D.C., that things may get worse before it gets better. So we are in a crash course, actually. We may have a serious crisis, but we value the partnership and the alliance, and things may get better. But I guess there is a significant point, not only about Syria, but when you look at the trajectory of Turkish-American relations for the last 10, 15 years, you keep seeing the same thing, that there is crisis points, and each and every time there are resolutions for this is the band-aid only. So I think the critical part that the U.S. foreign policy makers may need to think is, there's a famous movie by Frank Capra, It's Wonderful Life. And the movie is about a gentleman who commits suicide, and angels save his life and show his town without him, you know, like how things will move forward. And American political scientists like this movie, like to show that what if America didn't exist, right? What if America didn't exist? And usually the picture they draw is this chaos in the world. There's no international system, there's no international order, everything, that's fine. But I think at one point they should stop and see that, what if our allies didn't exist? What kind of world or international system we would have if the US alliance system didn't exist? So we keep hearing all the time the accusations from Washington, D.C. that Turkey is not a reliable ally. And we have been seeing this in each and every critical juncture in relations, that there are some accusations that is Turkey a reliable ally? Should Turkey be in NATO? I think at one point they should ask the same questions, because in many parts of the world, not only in Turkey, in critical U.S. allies, look at the concern of Japan right now, look at Poland, look at all of the US allies around the world, how nervous they are. And they should ask the question that, well, maybe we are doing something that destroys the reliability of the United States, shakes the credibility of the US foreign policy, and make our foreign policy not predictable, not certain, not decisive enough to be the superpower. So I guess at some point, the Washingtonians need to ask that question in order to understand the value of alliance. And while negotiating this deal, they should see, like where this relationship will go. In a previous panel, I said, like the things may get better if the expectation is low. And it's just like marriage, when you keep the expectation, things will get better. But many of us know that if the expectation is too low, the marriage may not work out. Right? So I think it's a good critical point right now that U.S. foreign policy makers should think not only about Turkey, their attitude towards the allies, their relationship with the U.S. allies in different parts of the world.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Michael.
It's a little bit of a dangerous attitude that I'm hearing from Kılıç. As much as I may understand where it's coming from, I think that, look, you have to admit, I mean, it pains me to admit it, but an American has to admit when you look at Washington today that America is very uncertain of its role in the world. And it's very uncertain, it's having a deep debate inside America about what America is. We've never been so polarized. You can't have this kind of internal polarization without it having an effect on foreign policy. But even beyond the political polarization, there's been a confusion in Washington since I've been involved. I've been there since 2005 about what exactly our role is in the Middle East. And so I don't think that tough love toward America, is what I heard Kılıç arguing for, is going to bring America to its senses. I think that Turkey has to help America understand what its role is. I mean, what I'm trying to say is Turkey has a role in guiding America to be an effective superpower. And I don't think that just beginning to consciously act not as America's ally is going to actually bring America to its senses. If President Erdogan has a decision right now he has to make, does he want to solve his security dilemmas in Syria in a Russian context or in an American context? If he starts solving them in a Russian context, I think that this is another way in which relations could get much worse very, very quickly. Because given the current high level of feeling against Turkey, it will be very hard for anyone to make the argument, even if they believed it, that we had a role in pushing him toward Russia.
Okay, so yeah, Matthew.
I was going to put an even finer point, a sharper point on your statement. I think President Trump doesn't want allies. He doesn't want them. He doesn't want to be bogged down in multilateral groupings because he thinks you make America great again because America is the strongest country, and therefore it does better in a transaction if it's just the United States against one other entity, one other body. I think that's fatally flawed. I mean, maybe I'm biased in the way I was raised, like all of us here, to believe in transatlanticism. I think that is going to destroy the power on which Trump is relying, but I think he would welcome a world without allies, except for when he needs them.
Yeah, go on. No, Michael first and then Kılıç.
I have to respond to you before you respond.
Okay, Kılıç first and then Michael. Yeah, you can fight later.
Who's going first?
Me,
Kılıç.
of course.
I came down on the side of Turkey.
I'm the guest here. Turkey.
Okay, go ahead.
See, I take advantage of his hospitality. I don't actually agree with you on that. I think that actually we're seeing Trump, don't listen to the words of Donald Trump. Just follow the actions. That's how, for all kinds of reasons, including the polarization. Donald Trump's body language shows, I think, very clearly that he wants good relations with Turkey. And what Trump likes nationalism. And he looks at Turkey and he sees a stable nationalist power that is willing to do things for itself. Right? The fact that Turkey went into northern Syria is deeply discomforting to Americans on many levels. But there is this other side where it shows that Turkey is actually willing to take action, which, when you look around the Middle East, the number of capable allies with militaries that can act is very, very small. So these are all things that Turkey has going for it in its relationship with Donald Trump, I think.
Two things. One is, I agree with Mike about Donald Trump. I don't think we have to see Donald Trump as the cause of this international system right now. It has been a while that the debates about the decline of unipolarity, decline of the international system, economic crisis, the skepticism about globalization, those discussions have been around for a while right now. If Donald Trump is not the cause, he may be the outcome of these debates. His position may be well liked by the Americans. And look at the, see the significance of the U.S. foreign policy for the electoral behavior in the elections. Basically, it is null. And each and every time since 1992, whichever presidential candidate come up with a significant foreign policy credential lost the election. This is George H. Bush, this is Al Gore, this is John McCain, and this is Hillary Clinton. So this is American public may like the messages that Donald Trump is giving. The second issue is about, it is not about losing the alliance or tough love. It is about, there is some point that Turkey may be ready to help, and other allies, including NATO allies, may be ready to help United States to understand the significance of the alliance. The great powers do not become great powers by just fighting alone. What makes great powers in the history great is the alliances they build, the institutionalization of that alliance, and the firm commitment that the superpower provides for the security of its other partners. So I think it's, Turkey can do its, role about reminding U.S. its power or its responsibilities, but United States should clarify what does it mean by burden sharing, right? So each and every time we started to see that U.S. presidents trash U.S. allies, right? President Obama used to call Middle East allies as free riders. President George Bush called U.S. allies as old Europe and new Europe. So there is a certain level of respect that United States should give to its allies and respect the security requirements of those allies to have that phase of a symbiotic relationship, a symbiotic alliance, that allies will remind United States its role and United States will act upon it. Thank you.
Okay, first of all, can I just thank the panel for moving already the discussion to look at the theme of the debate through the context of who is sitting in the White House and who the president of Turkey is, but possibly more significantly because of the recent American decisions, people are wondering whether this would have happened under any other president apart from Donald Trump, who has said for years on the campaign trail, I'm going to bring troops home. And as you're saying, Michael, that he has this idea about how the Americans should not be involved in the Middle East. Also, to Kılıç for just giving us that idea that Donald Trump may actually be the product of anti-globalization rather than one of the spurs towards further anti-globalization. That's the first time I've heard that, an interesting theory. Okay, so Çağrı, let's get the Turkish point of view here about the guy who sits in the White House. In the past few days, I've been on air every single day since Operation Peace Spring started. And every single day, there are 5 or 6 lines coming out of the White House that give an idea about how Donald Trump is thinking about relations with Turkey and about America's involvement in Syria. Here are just some of them. These are some quotes from Donald Trump over the course of the past week and a half. Turkey has been great to deal with. I will destroy Turkey economically. Turkey has a problem on its border. The Kurds are no angels. The PKK may be worse at terror than ISIS. Everyone hates Daesh. Turkey perhaps not quite as much. That one was like, well, what are you talking about? Do people want us to go to war with a NATO member? Turkey is an important NATO member. There's a lot of sand over there. Let them fight their own wars. We're not a policing agent. So when the President of the United States talks like this, Çağrı, how is Turkey supposed to react? I think it's really interesting what Michael said. Don't worry about what Trump says, worry about what he does. Is that the way Turkey approaches it?
A Turkish news anchor woman made an analysis after reading these very different and controversial tweets. She said, okay, it's not a surprise. He is Gemini, you know.
Gemini, yeah.
Gemini, yes.
Two faces.
Two faces.
Yeah.
I can say this because I am also Gemini. No problem. So it is funny to read this, and it is incredible to see that that guy is the president of the United States or president of anywhere. But on the other hand, we have to ask maybe a question. What is or who is United States now in terms of foreign policy making? Because when we are talking about foreign policy in Turkey, okay, we look at what president says and what the Minister of Foreign Affairs says, and to some extent what Minister of Defense says. But 100%, they are all converging with each other because there are targets regionally, globally, domestically, and it is decided through some analyses and discussions within the party, within the government, within the cabinet. Then it is announced to the public and it is pursued. But when it comes to the U.S. foreign policy to our region or towards Turkey, there is no one channel to whom we should take as a counterpart, whom we should trust, whatever it says. So in the levels of analysis, I see 4 different levels in the United States. The first one is public level, as you mentioned. Now, it is intentionally, Turkey is portrayed as a country which is planning an ethnic cleansing in the region towards the Kurds. So there is an anti-Turkish sentiment in the public level. And unfortunately, it is fired by some channels in the media, and of course we should not forget the FETO terrorist organization.
Yeah,
what
we will
they
talk
are,
about that as well.
they are doing in Washington and in many other cities. In legislative level, in U.S. Congress, there is also an anti-Turkish sentiment, and the anti-Turkish sentiment did not start with the Syrian incident. Well before, there was a series of attempts to impose sanctions over Turkey. It started with the Halkbank case, and then came the Pastor Brunson, then came the F-35 S-400 issue. So this 2 years or 3 years, starting from the second half of Obama administration, the relations between United States and Turkey is totally in negative manner in all levels. The third level is governmental level, but when we came to government level, it is not easy to decide who is the government. I mean, is it the president? Is it the Secretary of State? Is it Pentagon? When it comes to our region, is it the CENTCOM or some retired, some generals, or someone who's taking pictures with PYD on the sea? So that's why maybe apart from president's tweets, some of the announcements of U.S. government officials also makes us confused about U.S. Foreign policy in the region. So when Turks and Americans are talking about the region and their respective foreign policies, I think 2 questions are quite important equally. The first one, what does Turkey want from the United States? And the answer is quite clear. We don't want the United States to support terrorism. That's clear. We don't want patriots. If you give us, it's okay. But if you don't, we can buy S-400. We don't want F-35. If you give us, it's okay. But if you don't, we can buy another one. But do not support Gulenist terrorist organization, PKK terrorist organization, YPT terrorist organization. Do not arm them. That is the only thing that Turkey wants from the United States in the region. Nothing else. When it comes to the second question, what does the United States want from Turkey?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know whether Trump also knows. I don't know whether the Secretary of State knows. I don't know whether the Secretary of Defense knows. What does the United States want from Turkey? If they can answer this question in a very clear manner, what I answered, what Turkey wants from the United States, then we can sit and negotiate on it. Because when we talk about this long process of S-400s, they always mention, don't buy it from the Russia. Okay, but Turkey wanted Patriots for 10 years, but they didn't provide us. So we should find some minimum level, at least to sit and start new discussion by answering these questions. What do we mutually want from each other?
Absolutely. Okay, Michael Doran is going to be leaving us. In about 10 minutes. So let's just quickly cover another couple of issues to do with what's happening in Syria and how it's affecting U.S.-Turkey relations. First of all, the homogeneity of the Kurds as it's been presented in the United States. You have even people like Lindsey Graham, who's been to Turkey a number of times. He clearly himself must know the difference between Kurds, YPG, PKK, but as you say, the narrative in the United States, because it's a great story, the Kurds, okay, who have been fighting Daesh. Matthew, how significant do you think it was? I don't know if you saw the news conference that Mike Pence gave after the meeting here when he came to Ankara, and he stood there at the US Embassy, and he said the Kurds, and then he said the Kurds, and then he said the YPG, yes. The YPG. I was convinced that having been in those meetings with the Turkish government and then reaching the deal, coming to the podium, he remembered, oh yes, I'm supposed to say those three letters, because I'd never heard, and I may be wrong, I can't cover every single bit of news going on in the US. I can't ever remember a senior US official saying YPG.
Yeah, it's quite rare. I mean, one person who did was then Secretary of Defense Ashton Carter in the Obama administration, who before the Senate Armed Services Committee basically admitted PKK.
Answering a question that Lindsey Graham had put to him.
Lindsey Graham's question, that they're one and the same organization, more or less. So, but that's a very important observation by you, Adnan, because I share that well, I tweeted about it when you said it. Yes, it's quite unusual for a U.S. official to differentiate between the groups, and that's a sign of something Çağrı was getting at just now about, U.S. should ask what it wants from Turkey, figure that out. Turkey should figure out what it wants from the U.S. because the U.S. doesn't know what it wants because it only doesn't want Turkey to do things. It's a negative agenda. And that's because during the course of these last 16 years, since March 1st, 2003, when the U.S. requested to liberate Iraq or invade Iraq through Turkey, and the Turkish Grand National Assembly said no, Turkey has begun slowly to emerge in the American strategic mind, if there is such a thing. I mean, there's so many minds, but it's begun to be portrayed as a problem rather than an asset, rather than a partner. And that deterioration of Turkey's reputation kind of took off quite dramatically with this operation in northern Syria. To me, that's the only way to understand why policymakers in the U.S. don't differentiate carefully, why they don't see that the goals of Operation Peace Spring are strategic goals of the United States as well, stabilizing northern Syria, getting rid of a terrorist threat, pushing the YPG back. That's actually U.S. policy to push the YPG back, even if some people in CENTCOM don't like it. So finally, my last point is the problem, Çağrı, is that in Washington, the normal process of foreign policy making that Michael and I knew when we served on the National Security Council staff has largely broken. First, then National Security Advisor John Bolton actually broke the system. He didn't like to have these meetings where all the government agencies could have their say. He wanted control. And then now President Trump is making policy by tweet. And so you see every day, practically, President Trump will make a statement that contradicts whatever Defense Secretary Esper may have said, or Secretary Pompeo. There's not a system.
So you're talking about Mark Esperanto. I don't know if you saw the tweet. Donald Trump deleted it very quickly where he called Mark Esper, his Secretary of Defense, Mark Esperanto. Anyway. Yeah, Michael?
I wanted to say something about this issue of not differentiating among the Kurds. There is a subtle thing here going on as well. I mean, there is a general lack of knowledge, but there's also something more subtle. When Turkey looks at the U.S. YPG relationship and it sees this statelet growing up in northeastern Syria, it has a whole understanding of its history of relations with the PKK, and it sees strategic depth and capability being developed. The Americans are just coming into this story directly now, and they don't see the threat. They don't see, as people keep saying in America over and over again, there are no cross-border raids. What are the Turks talking about? There's no raids going on. And there's another element here too, and that's nobody that I know in America really understands the relations between Kandil and the YPG. And the Americans who are on the ground working with the YPG see, and this is part of the reality that they're reading, and it's a big part of the reality. They see people who are simply defending their homes from ISIS. And they're dealing with people who live there. This is their home. They have enemies, and the Americans have developed personal relationships with them. So you see something, I mean, quite remarkable in terms of the broken policy. Serving military officers on the ground, calling up friends in the media and saying, the president betrayed, I feel betrayed. I've never been ashamed to be an American soldier before, I'm ashamed now. And a total breakdown in discipline and an effort to undermine Trump. But I have no doubt at all that when they say those things, they're sincerely felt. Absolutely sincerely felt. And that's a big problem that Trump has. The mill-to-mill relationship between Turkey and the American military has broken down. And as Trump has tried to come to an agreement with Erdogan about the border, he's run into this problem that the guys on the ground simply do not see the threat that Turkey sees.
Çağrı, how concerned is Turkey?
Can I add something?
Yeah, go on, Kılıç, yeah.
I think, I'm not sure if it is I'm not sure if the broken system is the cause, the consequence. Because what we see in in the Middle East is there's a lack of strategy. And because of that, the unpredictability and uncertainty is partly because there is not an overarching strategy that was provided by the Bush administration, Clinton administration, or Obama administration that will shape and design U.S. foreign policy in the region. So in the absence of that overarching strategy, what we started to see that there's a tactical and operational moves. And whoever is responsible for that operation becomes the policymaker, runs the policy, and shapes the policy making. Just like U.S. military in Syria right now. There is no Syria policy. So what's happening is counterterrorism has become the Syria policy of the United States. And that's the only policy of the United States. So what this brings is there is a lack of creativity in the U.S. diplomatic corps about that. What is happening in the last couple of days actually about Turkey is, think about how many times the word sanction was used by someone in the US government, whether it's the Congress or the State Department or Pentagon or White House, to resolve this conflict. President Trump said, I'm sanctioning Turkey, and then Secretary of Defense released a statement saying that we will sanction Turkey as well. In the meantime, we started to see the draft resolution of sanction packages from the Congress. Van Hollen Graham said, I will sanction Turkey, we will sanction Turkey. In the meantime, Foreign Relations Chairman in the House of Representatives, Congressman Engel said, no, I will sanction Turkey. In the meantime, the conference chairwoman Liz Cheney said, hey, I have a resolution to sanction Turkey. So is this the way to resolve the conflict? You see that there is a lack of creativity to let alone conflict resolution, conflict mitigation, or crisis management at this point. So I think when you look at that broken decision-making mechanism, you can see that the lack of strategy starts from the very beginning when President Clinton rejects an overarching grand strategy to shape US foreign policy in the aftermath of Cold War.
Okay, Çağrı, listen, Michael, I know you've got 2 or 3 minutes left. Let's see if you can contribute one last thought to this, okay? Beyond the diplomacy that Kılıç is talking about, regarding the practicalities of keeping Turkish territory and Turkish citizens secure, how concerned is the government that some of those American weapons that have been given to the YPG could end up in the hands of the PKK, and then the PKK carries out terror attacks inside Turkey with those weapons?
They already transferred. There are a lot of reports that unfortunately some of the weapons which were given to YPG were already transferred to PKK. And you know, according to American reports recently published, the militants of PKK are the same guys with the militants of YPG. So they are not 2 different terrorist organizations. They just cross the border. They go and fight inside with YPG. Then the same guys with their new IDs, PKK IDs and hats, they go across the border and they make terrorist attacks over Turkey. Therefore, unfortunately, we missed a chance to stop it because President Erdogan repeatedly asked Mr. Trump to just take back all these weapons. He has been asking for 2 years. But now, unfortunately, we see that those arms and ammunitions some of them are in the hands of PKK. I hope this new conciliation with the U.S. would prevent more to be transferred to PKK. But we, of course, should cooperate from these moments also for dismantling of YPG, PKK terrorist organization, not only in north of Syria, but also in south of Syria. Because terrorist organization is a terrorist organization, either in the west of Euphrates, east of Euphrates, north of Euphrates, south of Euphrates. If this is a terrorist organization, it makes terrorism everywhere. And we should not forget that all terrorist organizations in the history of United States, which were this way or this way were supported, then became like boomerang, a threat for United States interests itself. So in order to prevent a future threat from PKK, it is time, and it would be a new and good start for re-flourishing of Turkish-American cooperation in the region, to cooperate against PKK, PYD, YPG in the region. And this could not only help as a start for treatment of Turkish-American relations, but also with clearly contribute for the stability of Syria, unity of Syria, and political future of Syria as well.
Michael, do you see that happening?
It all depends what happens in the south, because on the one hand, the president originally said we're pulling all the troops out except for a few at Tanif, but now they're talking about continuing to hold the oil. So they're going to take the SDF. It looks like there's some idea out there, whether it'll happen or not, it's not clear to me, to use the SDF to stabilize the sort of Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor. And if that happens, then the YPG-U.S. relationship will continue. Now, this is, who knows how this will evolve, because this will be YPG U.S. relations in an area that's not a Kurdish majority area. These are all Arab areas. So what that looks like in the end, I don't know. And how worried Turkey would be by it, I don't know either. But I'm not sure we're at the point where there's a totally clean break between the U.S. and the YPG. If all the troops leave, or if some stay and they use only Arab elements in the SDF, and there's a break with the YPG, then we could get back to something like used to exist in the 1980s, where the United States supported Turkey against its enemies, and the PKK was working with the Soviet Union. It was kind of a cleaner picture, then. Looks to me like we're going to go through a blurry area here.
Okay, so we have about 25 minutes to go. Michael, you are free to leave the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, Michael Doran from the Hudson Institute is sadly leaving us, but thank you so much to Michael. Thanks, Michael. Okay, so we've obviously concentrated the bulk of the discussion on the situation in northeastern Syria because it's the pertinent current one. But let's look at some of the other areas of divergence now. And Çağrı, you had mentioned the FETO terrorist organization, the man who leads it, who's accused by Ankara of being the orchestrator of the coup 3 years ago, the failed coup attempt. The Americans refused to extradite him. They say all the evidence, 85 boxes of evidence presented by Turkey that proves that Fethullah Gulen has these connections to the putschists, if you want to call them that. They say it doesn't come up quite to the standard that our law requires for the extradition to happen. Çağrı, what's your understanding here? Is Turkey going to just continue to rely on that information that it's already given, or it is prepared to give more information to secure this extradition? Turkey's been asking for a few years now.
I think it is not a matter of judiciary anymore in the United States. It's a matter of political issue. Okay, because each and every document which clearly can be seen as an evidence that the FETO organization, Gulenist terrorist organization, is behind the coup attempt in 2016, were given to the United States Department of Justice. There is nothing more. So everything is documented. Everything is documented that the guy in Pennsylvania is behind this coup attempt, and he is the leader of a terrorist organization. But as far as we understand, as Matthew mentioned about the relations between the PKK and United States in 1990s, because PKK was not seen as a terrorist organization, not seen, but recognized as a terrorist organization that time. As far as we understand, United States, at least some government officials and some agencies in the United States, they have a very long history with FETO terrorist organization. When we look at some evidence, we can take it back to 1970s. I mean, some US officials had meetings with FETO leaders in 1970s, in 1980s, and with start of mid-1980s, this organization was seen as an apparatus to fill the gap in post-Cold War era, particularly in Central Asia, in Caucasus, and their institutions, their schools were supported by US government in order to educate and train pro-American or globalist young generations. And they use it as a political apparatus as well in Turkey. And these long-lasting relations prevents now any US government to admit the extradition of this guy and or just send him for a trial. Because I think there is a huge concern in US government that those guys would confess during the trial that they had links with U.S. diplomats, U.S. Intelligence agents, U.S. governments, etc. Those guys, their names would be unveiled, and their links and their both economic and political ties would be unveiled, and this would create a new political scandal in the United States domestic policy. I think this is the main concern. So they don't want to show to the public, both American public and the world public, that they had not created, but they supported for 3 decades an organization to for some political targets in Central Asia, in Africa, not only in Turkey, but all over the world, in the Balkans as well.
Sure. Matthew.
Yeah, I have a slightly different view. But by the way, you can add Texas, too, where there's charter schools, and New Jersey, where Fethullah Gülen has charter schools. But having been in the middle of all this making of the foreign policy sausage in the White House and in the State Department, and specifically on Turkey, my experience was different. It may be hard to believe, but my experience was different. So shortly after September 11th, there were lots of people in Ankara in high positions who were suggesting, hey, have you ever heard of this guy Fethullah Gülen? He lives in Pennsylvania. You should read what he writes, because he writes what a lot of us are saying, that there's full compatibility between democracy and Islam, violence is bad, and we can bring societies together. So I think a lot of U.S. officials after September 11th, 2001, thought that by taking a look at Gülen and his writings and his organization, they were doing something that Ankara not only did not oppose, but maybe supported. And that all happened up until 2013, and we all know what happened in December of 2013. So I don't think anyone would be afraid of divulging these ties with FETO. What I think happened was that all that information, those 72 boxes of information that landed on some poor bureaucrat's desk in the Department of Justice, was overwhelming. And it needed to be sorted through and organized. And I've long advocated that Turkey would be really smart to hire a team, as it did, of great lawyers and opposition political research firms that know how to find the key bits of data and then get them out into the public and in the Congress and then all throughout the U.S. government, so many agencies that will be involved in a decision like this. Just as you were talking about, you're saying, who runs U.S. foreign policy? Many people. So you need a very clearly organized set of arguments to get that now kind of broken down bureaucracy to move in the right direction, and then get enough information before a judge to decide on extradition. Thanks.
Kılıç, I want to get your thoughts on this, but allow me just to at least impress upon our audience how prepared I am for this session, okay? I read the entire U.S. Turkey extradition treaty for you. It's actually only 21 pages, but it's 44 articles. So it says, extradition shall not be granted if the offense is of a political character. And maybe you could argue that it was, right? That's according, it should be not of a political character, according to the requesting party, Turkey. However, now here for me is the crux. Any offense committed or attempted against a head of state or a head of government shall not be deemed to be an offense of a political character. So it's not an offense of a political character, right? We know the story. Erdogan's life was under threat. He could possibly have been killed at that moment. He wasn't, but there's the reason why it's not an offense for political character. Therefore, Çağrı, but you've answered it already, so let's go to Kılıç. Therefore, the only connection left that needs to be proven is Gülen's connections to the coup people, to the people who physically tried to carry out the coup on that night in July 2016. So do you feel, Kılıç, again, Çağrı says no, Turkey's government has presented everything it is going to present, but do you feel that there should be another case made, that there should be more evidence presented to get the extradition to be completed to Turkey's satisfaction?
I think, of course, we are not in the bureaucracy. We don't know what are the objections of the United States for the evidences provided
The
by
only thing
Turkey
they
since
literally
then.
say, the only thing they say is it doesn't meet our standard. And you know this is right. It doesn't meet our standard for an extradition to happen.
Well, it would be a little more complicated because this reaction to U.S. about the July 15 coup attempt is much more complicated. So you have to understand that the reaction of the Turkish people to the U.S. immediately after the coup depends on multiple different things. One is, of course, the first reactions of the United States for the coup attempt. When the Secretary Kerry made this awkward statement saying that United States support continuity and stability in Turkish foreign policy. And the second statement came at 2 a.m. from the White House, a very awkward statement. Never read a statement like that, saying that it starts with President Kerry had this phone call with President Obama. You don't see this in presidential statements. And the statement came without the using of the C word, right? There is no mention of the coup attempt. Think about the skepticism of the Turkish people and the fact that United States never used the C word in order to describe what happened in Egypt a couple years ago. And on top of that, Turkish people's reaction focused on the Gülen's presence in the United States. And I'm not sure what United States wanted out of as an evidence from Turkey. And it was another unfortunate moment that immediately after the coup attempt, the Director of National Intelligence made a statement saying that, well, we don't have the evidence that will connect Gülen to the coup. So this is much more complicated. And I think when you look at the Turkish side, not only the connection, but also the confessions and everything, Turkish side believes that they have solid evidence that will connect the coup. Whether it is direct order or source of inspiration, it is a different story, but there is a direct connection with that. But if you insist that it is not, and if you do not want to make move, if you do not cooperate enough about that, of course it will create another crisis of confidence and crisis of trust between two countries.
Çağrı, you want to say something?
Yes, we focus on the current situation, but I think in order to analyze the nature of FETO and its link with the United States establishment, we have to go back to 1990s, late 1990s, the first time when Fethullah Gülen moved to United States. So maybe Matthew, because he's served as a diplomat and a government officer, maybe you know, what kind of visa is that? I mean, provided for him, and he is there. As far as I know, he is not a citizen of the United States. He did not naturalize, but he stays there for 20 years. So the visa never expires. So this is a special one given to someone, a Turkish citizen that time. So, and this visa of 20 years is always prolonged within the terms of 5 different presidents. I mean, when he moved to the United States, it was Mr. Clinton. Then came Mr. Bush. He served for 2 terms. Then came Mr. Obama, served for 2 terms. Now it's Trump's first term. So 5 different presidents, but he's there. So if you elaborate much more about this legal situation, apart from Turkish legal requirement for extradition, but what kind of legal status does that guy have in the United States?
Matthew?
Sure, he has a permanent residency status, so-called green card. So when he went to Turkey, I don't know what kind of a visa he had, but probably your typical tourist, business person visa, but then was able to change his status, as many, many people do once they get to the US, and then acquired permanent residency status. But there have been reviews of that permanent residency status. I was involved with one, and the debate comes down to something that now should be resolvable. Before it was, well, is there tangible evidence that he supports terrorism? And the people doing the review were thinking about not terrorism in Turkey, but Al-Qaeda and then later ISIS. So again, this gets back to the point we've been coming to in every intervention, that for some reason, American policymakers just can't wrap their head around the fact that the PKK really is a terrorist. I mean, the Gülen working with these organizations really is committing terrorist actions. Now that there's been a coup attempt, then it should be easier. Because if it's a coup, then it is terrorism. But as Kılıç said, exactly, the U.S. government has been careful to avoid the C word, as you called it. So still not recognizing this as terrorism.
Okay, so listen, we'll let you have coffee very, very quickly, but just a couple of other points. So in your notes, you may have it, that the other area and theme for discussion regarding divergence would be Turkey's potential future in NATO. Çağrı already mentioned buying the S-400 missile system from the Russians because the Americans weren't prepared to sell the Patriots to Turkey. How much is that going to affect Turkey's position in NATO? But there's also the other issue, and we can just talk about these two very quickly, and it's not in your notes, but it suddenly occurred to me that the American reaction, especially the reaction in the White House to the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, when the CIA said that their intelligence suggested that Mohammed bin Salman had ordered it, and everything that Turkey was trying to do to bring the truth out and to hold somebody accountable, and for Donald Trump to tell Gina Haspel, the head of the CIA, I don't want to listen to the tape, it's disgusting, and then say, okay, I'm not really sure if the CIA has got this right. So shall we talk about NATO first? What's the situation? Kılıç, what's the situation, do you think, regarding Turkey's position in NATO after the purchase of the S-400s?
Well, in regards to S-400, I think it is well circulated argument. So it is, I don't want to repeat the arguments that and the debates that has been taking place since the S-400 issue emerged. But let me say a few things about it. One, the air and missile defense system of Turkey, the request to receive it starts with the first Gulf War, actually. And when the Saddam Hussein, a guy, think about this, there is a guy in your southern border, Iraq, and he is threatening Turkey, and we figure out in the first Gulf War that the guy has Scud missiles that can target Turkey. And immediately, United States sends some Patriots, NATO sends some Patriots, and try to provide the security. And then the Syria crisis took place. And we again figure out that another neighbor of us, Bashar Assad, has Scud missiles. And it is in the range of targeting Turkey. And put yourself into the shoes of Turkish policymakers, Turkish security people who are responsible for protecting the security, territorial integrity, and air bases and air force of Turkey. The first thing it comes to mind was again to get it from the United States. You have to remember why this lack of confidence emerged. United States, Germany, Spain, some other countries sent Patriot missiles to Turkey, actually, to protect the airspace immediately after the F-4 crisis with Syria. What happened was, there is a moment, you see there is a moment in Turkish-US relations, there is those moments of crisis, and there is those moments of lack of total disregard to Turkey's national security concerns. United States, after a while, moves out the Patriot missiles. And then the military leaks to Washington Post that Turks were not informed about that previously, right? Then the NATO members try to cover that. However, there is this idea that, okay, you know, we cannot be totally dependent on NATO partners in case of emergencies. Think about Turkey. 6 countries around Turkey has missile systems that can target Turkey. And some of them have very advanced air and missile defense systems. So there is a strategic gap here. And in order to close that gap, of course, you have to apply for getting those missiles. It didn't work out. Patriot didn't work out for different reasons, but the 3 conditions that Turkey put from the very beginning. And this is important, that Turkey has been very consistent. When you look at the missile defense system, 3 things that Turkey requested for each and every producer country is very consistent. It is fast delivery, technology transfer, and concern about pricing. And we know that Turkey tried to buy HQ-9 missiles from China, and after long negotiations, it didn't work out. But part of that issue was NATO was talking about interoperability as the biggest issue. And then immediately after July 15 coup attempt, Russia approached with S-400. And Turkey this time was careful. Turkey said we will not integrate the system to NATO systems. So what we're gonna do is, it's a standalone system, it's a stopgap measure until we produce our own defense system with either with Loramits project or with Eurosam. Again, there was no response, right? So, and we have to figure out if when S-400 started to create a crisis. The first statement from Secretary of Defense, James Mattis, when the debate started about S-400 was, it's a sovereign decision of Turkey, right? And NATO said, well, if it's not interoperable, so we don't know what Turkey will gonna do, it's as a standalone system. But when the things started to get much more serious, we started to see some resolution in the Congress try to prevent this. And it was when the resolution first came to the US Congress, it was totally not about S-400 issue. It was the Brunson crisis that some in the Congress started to say that, well, it's a Brunson crisis, they are getting S-400, so why they are getting F-35? So when you look at the way that the message was conveyed to Turkish authorities, when this process was handled by the US weapon makers, in this case it is Raytheon, right, about the technology sharing, you can understand that there is a problem here. And the problem is not on the part of the Turkey. Turkey was very consistent. Turkey never said that we will not get S-400. From the 2015 August, the first trip of President Erdogan to Moscow, Turkey was very clear that, okay, we will get a system, it's a stopgap measure. And they were expecting a sympathy of understanding from the allies around the world that this is something necessary for Turkey, considering the failed states around Turkey that export insecurity, considering the threats of missile systems around Turkey that can target major cities. And remember that it is 2016, there is more than 20 huge terrorist attacks, and we don't know, because of the relation of the US with YPG, we don't know what kind of capacity YPG built in terms of missile systems.
Okay, so yeah, no, I actually literally want you to answer some of these issues, but I also want to ask you, is there a feeling in the Turkish government that possibly because of the purchase of the S-400 and the American reaction to stop Turkey having F-35s, which of course it contributes so much money in engineering to, is there a feeling in Turkey that Washington might even be considering trying to push Turkey out of NATO?
Yes, but how?
No, but at least is the Turkish government considering the situation that it might have to respond if this kind of situation occurs?
There are some American columnists and even some politicians, and most of them are irresponsible politicians, including some senators recently, talking about pushing Turkey out of NATO. First, bad news, guys, this is impossible. Impossible because the Washington Treaty, which established North Atlantic Treaty Organization, they did not have and does not have any clauses for pushing out any member. If there would be, it would be through unanimous decision. Of course, out of 28 members, excluding Turkey, one of them at least would oppose it. Some of them already clarified their reaction, like Hungary, for example, by giving support to Turkish peacekeeping operation, like Spain, for instance. So it is impossible to push out Turkey through any NATO legal mechanism. So it is just not a good thing to talk about this. It is just waste of time and waste of business. Secondly, this S-400 systems, it has nothing to do with NATO itself. I'm an international relations professor. After the Cold War, I do not recall any NATO decision or resolution or recommendation, whatever you call, that defining Russia as an enemy. Is Russia a NATO enemy? I don't think so. There is no reference to there is no reference in any NATO resolution defining Russia as an enemy. So Turkey is not buying from an enemy. Turkey is buying from Russia. If Russia is an enemy, then why did not NATO prohibit any NATO member to buy ammunition and arms systems
Yes,
from an enemy?
other NATO members have
Yes.
bought Russian missile
So-
systems, right?
No. So we can ask from NATO, okay, if you see that Turkish purchase of S-400 from Russia is a threat on you, then why do not just pass a resolution to prohibit it? Why don't you? Just prohibit all kinds of transactions from Russia. So it is none of business of NATO. Already Secretary General of NATO, many higher officials, they mentioned that it is Turkey's sovereign decision to buy S-400s. Okay, there are some analyses, they say, okay, this system is not compatible with NATO system. It is not necessary to be compatible with NATO system. We have four armies in Turkey. 3 of them are in cooperation and under NATO command. 1 of them is out of NATO command. Our Aegean army is not under the umbrella of NATO command. And some of our armed forces are not under the umbrella of NATO command. So it is not necessarily to have all arms and defense systems in a country, NATO country, compatible with NATO systems. And the third critics came from some analyses that they said, okay, if Turkey locates these S-400 Russian missile systems in Turkish soil, then they can have an electronic interaction with F-35s and they can just steal the technology and all software systems and they can transfer it to the Russian military, for example. This was a critic. And another bad news, guys, they already did it. And not because Turkey purchased S-400, because they did not operable yet, but because Russians have S-400s in Syria and Israelis have F-35 and they are flying it over Syria. So if these S-400s are capable to intervene to the systems of F-35, it is already done. Not because of Turkey, but because of Israel Air Force have their F-35 planes.
Can I add one thing about this?
Hold on, let Çağrı just finish this thought.
Just one sentence. I think it is not a matter of NATO, it's not a matter of damage on NATO security or the alliance security, but the sole reason of United States, why United States is against Turkish S-400 purchase is that because they don't want Turkey be a bad example. Because if Turkey buys it, better technology, cheaper price, there is no direct congressional approval, etc. There is no preconditions where to put, how to use, then many other countries would follow Turkey. Saudis will follow Turkey, India will follow Turkey, many other countries start to buy non-American arms. And this is a big threat on American military industrial complex. That's why this is something they sell and they don't want any competitors on the market. That's why they wanted Turkey. But on the other hand, of course, excluding Turkey from F-35 operation, it also have a big damage on American military industrial complex, which already President Trump mentioned.
Yes, he has,
in
absolutely,
Japan.
absolutely. And just a couple of days ago.
One thing
Okay,
I have
60
to add,
seconds.
60 seconds. One, you have to understand the opposition of the US and the responses. One, it is not interoperable, and the Turkish response is it's a standalone system. Two, there will just buy Patriot, and the Turkish response is, okay, we will buy Patriot as well, and there is no response. And finally, about F-35, it is intercepting F-35 signals, and Turkey's response is, let's get a technical group, let's set a technical group and work together, and there is no response. And finally, about NATO, I travel, every month I come to this country and talk with some people, interview them, never seen an official who thinks that leaving NATO is a good option. And those in Washington who argue that Turkey should leave NATO, Turkey should be left out of NATO, has no response about the question, what can it bring, what kind of benefit can it bring to NATO? Right? Without Turkey, is NATO a better off organization or not? So these are only the talking points. Because of that, they are better argued on Twitter instead of long-term strategic perspective arguments.
Sure, okay, well, we didn't get to talk about the international reaction and specifically in the White House to the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. So I began with a quote from Henry Kissinger. I'll end with a Chinese saying, which is, always consider the face of the owner before deciding if you're going to kick the dog. Okay? Every action has a reaction. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much indeed. Çağrı, Michael, who's not here, Matthew, and Kılıç as well, your panel. Thanks a lot. Coffee break and then another session.
Great.